So we have two more sections that we're going to do on plants before we get into animals. The first section is going to be Chapter 3, Lesson 5. Chapter 3, Lesson 5 is going to be talking about how plants respond or grow. So we have different time periods that they're going to grow in, but the biggest thing that I want you to understand is tropism. Tropism is a reaction to a stimuli and how they're going to behave. And we have two different types of tropism. We have a positive tropism and we have a negative tropism. Now this is a term that you're going to hear from this point forward anytime you talk about plants and their growth in sciences throughout all of your education career. So when I talk about positive, we're going to talk about that it's going to grow toward, and we talk about negative, so it's going to grow away from or move away from. We actually have movement that's going to happen when it comes to touch, gravity, as well as light. So let's start with touching. Touching has a specific name for tropism in the tropism category. It's called Thigmotropism. So tropism is to react to. Thigmo is the base word for just simply touching. So when we talk about Thigmotropism, we're talking about how plant parts react to touch within itself. So there's an example of a vine. This type of vine, it'll hold on to something and it'll begin to grow and wrap around. Now it's not something like you would see on a movie where it comes out, reaches and starts wrapping and it's got a hold of this plant within 30 seconds. This is something that does happen over a few days, maybe even a few weeks, depending on what type of species this vine would be. But the idea for the vine is that it wraps around, and then as this plant begins to grow tall, it reaches the leaves of that vine up higher to the sky. So if you've ever gone out to the woods and you've noticed these big vines hanging out of the trees, you might think, how in the world did that vine climb all the way up there and wrap itself in that branch? It didn't. It started out wrapping itself around the little sapling. And then as that sapling began to grow and grow and grow, then that vine was being stretched and pulled up with it. So as the tree began to expand, the branches went out, then this vine was pulled up, its roots stayed in the ground, and then it began to stretch out with its stem and get the sun's light way at the top of that tree. And that's its just natural response on how it grows. Another type would be this vine here, where they wrap around completely on the plant. These are going to be short-term plants because what they end up doing is they actually end up choking off the plant as it begins to try to grow and expand. Another type of thigmotropism is we will see more in tropical plants. But like these ferns, they have a reaction system. They want to protect themselves. So the moment that this pencil lead touches one of these little leaflets, they close up, they fold. They don't like being touched. The opposite to that would be this type of plant, which is a Venus flytrap. They want to be touched. They're going to be open, and they have these little itty bitty sticky things inside of them, so that when an insect begins to crawl and get stuck inside, then underneath the sticky side, once it closes its mouth, it has little prongs that poke into whatever insect gets trapped. And those little prongs are kind of like the flagella on the fungus. They stick inside the insects and they begin to insert chemicals that dissolve them, and they suck out the juices from those insects. Another type of thigmotropism happens in our root system. So if I look at roots in a rocky area, these roots begin to wrap around the rocks. Now they're not wrapping around to catch them, they're wrapping around them so they can go down and further and find the water. If I look at this one as it landed, well, it didn't land on good soil, but it had a crack to go to. So they wrap around the rock and they will expand, trying to find a water supply. Or on this one where it began to grow in the moss at the top of this rock, and the roots went down and around the rocks, it's actually a boulder, and sunk its roots into the soil so it could have a water supply. So thigmotropism is the response to touch. It could be quick, like the Venus flytrap, once it fills that insect and it closes, or it could take a really long period of time. This happened over decades so that tree could continue to thrive and grow. Gravity. Gravity's tropism is pretty obvious as to what it means. Gravitropism. So the response to gravity and how that plant interacts with it. So when I think about gravity, trees and stems, leaves of plants, they want to grow directly straight up. So it looks like a storm came along and kind of knocked this tree out of its base, and you can see the root bulb kind of leaning up out of the ground, and the tree, it just adapted. It grew up. We'll see, or we could see if we did an experiment on seeds. When we notice where the root is of the seed, if we would turn the seed upside down, that root would wrap itself all the way around and still grow down. Roots have a positive gravitropism to gravity, so they pull towards it. We have the opposite, it's considered a negative tropism for the stem and the leaves of the plant because they want to grow away from the gravity. The gravity pulls us towards the earth, the opposite would be up in the air. So plants, most plants that we see have a negative tropism. They want to grow away from gravity, where all of their roots are a positive tropism. They grow down towards the source of the gravity, which is the center of the earth. If this plant was turned sideways, it would begin to grow straight up because it wants to grow up nice and tall because it's responding to gravity. Or this one where they planted it and they hung the pot completely upside down. It's not growing and turning up because of light. It's growing and turning up because of gravitropism. Stems and leaves want to go away from the center of the earth, away from the source of gravity. So they bend and they begin to turn up as the plant continues to grow. The final one then is phototropism. And photo means light. So if I'm talking about light, I'm talking about the response to light in a positive or negative way. And most plants have a positive response to light because if it wasn't for light, they wouldn't have photosynthesis, and without photosynthesis, they can't survive. So most of our plants you'll see are always going to grow towards the light, wherever that light source is. Notice this poor flower is leaning almost out of its pot just to get the light. Well, what happens is we have this hormone inside of plants called auxin. And auxin is one of those chemicals inside of cells, but it activates when one side is not getting enough light. And basically what happens is inside these cells on this side, on this side, on this side, they overproduce auxin. So those cells actually extend and bend the plant towards the light. If I want to straighten any of those plants up, I would just simply turn them around to where they're leaning away from the light, and the auxins on that opposite side then are going to extend those stems. They're going to straighten back up, and then they're going to go towards the light again. So if I turn this plant around, it would be leaning away. The auxins would cause it to straighten up, and then they would lean towards the light. If I turn this plant around, the auxins on the opposite side would begin to extend. It would stand up and then lean towards the light. So you may notice that your moms, your dads, your grandmas, whoever has plants in their home, that they turn them about every 2 weeks. Because if you don't, your plants all begin to lean and look a little funny. So we start with our questions on page 120. Question 1a is simply, well, what is tropism? So tropism is a plant's response toward or away, because it could be positive or negative, to a stimulus. By the way, if you didn't get that, then go ahead and pause the video and then restart it once you have your answer written down. So then our other thing that we're going to do is we're going to now connect it to light, and we're going to talk about growth. So if I have photoperiodism, so photo meaning light, periodism is an amount of time. And we have plants that are very susceptible to the amount of light that they get throughout the day. So the first one we're going to talk about is the type of plants that I would see right now, which are called short day plants. These short day flowers or plants only grow and bloom when the day is less than 12 hours. One of the most popular ones in the fall is going to be your mums. And one of the most popular ones during the wintertime, when those days are really, really short, is your poinsettias. So mums respond as the days suddenly begin to get shorter, they begin to bloom. It's why a lot of us put mums out in the fall, because that's about the only flower that we can get regularly on a pretty accessible basis in this area that would add color outside. When it begins to have short days, they begin to bloom and turn colorful. In the wintertime, when our days are the shortest, then our poinsettias come out, and you would actually start seeing berries forming here in the center. It's when they respond. In the middle of summer, poinsettias just simply stay green and they don't berry up to reproduce. The second one is a long day, so that's just the opposite. When our days are much longer, so that's going to be in our summertime, right? So in our summertime, when we have 16 to 18 hours a day, and the rest of it's night, which isn't very long at all, or it doesn't seem like it's long at all, then that's when most of our pretty flowers, as we think of them, begin to show up. But it's not just flowers, it's also vegetables. We have these irises, and these irises, they're looking for the longest days possible. And that's when they really begin to pop out, they begin to bloom, and you get all of their different colors. But flowers, or vegetables, like these flowering lettuce, react the same way. Lettuce is going to come full head, form their meaty parts of the vegetable in the longest parts of the day. So the longest parts of the day is when we have our summer, and that's when our lettuces react as well. And then we got the middle ground. The middle ground for photoperiodism is just referred to as day neutral. So on day neutral plants, it's right in the center. Right in the center where summer and fall begin to mix, and we have 12 hours of day and 12 hours of night. That's when your dandelions really strike it up. That's when your tomatoes really begin to ripen up. Not in the dead of summer where it's really hot, but as it begins to cool down and we begin to think about changing into our fall time. Then we talk about going into our fall time with dormancy. Now, we're going to talk about animals here in our next chapter section and beginning and moving forward. But when we talk about animals, we're more used to the idea of animals in hibernation. We know there's a lot of animals that when it gets cooler outside, they begin to really eat, and then their metabolism slows down, and they go to sleep for long periods of time, for months. Well, these organisms are hibernating. When we talk about plants, it's not called hibernating, even though it's the same type of response. It's called dormancy. So in our area, we're used to that because we are in a deciduous area where we have extreme differences between our summer and springs and our winters and fall temperatures. When that temperature begins to change from being hot constantly and starts to cool down, then our trees know winter's coming. And if winter's coming and they still have their leaves on, they're going to lose a lot of their water and it's going to end up killing them. So they start to change color. And what happens when these colors are forming is basically the cells just stop producing chlorophyll. And without chlorophyll, they can't be green. And so for the majority of them, they have pigments underneath the chlorophyll that we don't see, because the chlorophyll is at the top layers, the epidermis of the leaves, and they look green as they're thriving through photosynthesis. But when the chlorophyll begins to dry up and it begins to die off and those cells begin to shut down, the yellows and the oranges begin to show through. And then some of our species of deciduous trees, they do create a new pigment, which is red. So it's the colors, the red that is newly created, the yellows and the oranges are their natural colors underneath the layers of the chlorophyll in the epidermis. So these colors show up where the reds are being produced. Why does that happen? Well, that happens because if those trees were going to continue to be exposed in the wintertime to all of the different temperatures, but that transpiration where the water is leaving the leaves, it's going to end up killing it. So they are going to hibernate just like the animals. They're going to reduce their amount of growth, they're going to reduce their amount of activity, and they're going to hibernate or go dormant throughout that frozen period of our winter. So now we have two more questions that we're going to answer. We fill in 2A and then we'll have 2B. Blank plants flower when nights are shorter than a critical length. So if our nights are shorter, the critical length is when they like to grow the most, then that should tell us that we're looking at a long day. So the critical period is the amount of time they're looking for to grow. So if it's a day neutral, they're looking for about 12 hours a day and 12 hours a night. If it's a short day, then they're looking for about 12 hours or more of night, which would mean short daytime. So this question tells us because it has a short amount of night, therefore it has to be a long day. Why do leaves change color? It's changing color because the chlorophyll inside begins to break down and be dissolved by the plant. And when that chlorophyll dries up and photosynthesis isn't happening, the actual pigment in the leaves is beginning to show up. That's the end of our lesson. We're going to do one more section, which is chapter 3.9, or chapter 3.6, excuse me, before we move on into animals. But there is an assignment. It is 10 questions. It should be up here on the table. Grab it and begin your work.